In the middle of a winter night over the Baltic, an unidentified formation appears on NATO radar screens. It looks like a swarm of drones headed toward undersea infrastructure and an airbase in Latvia. At the same time, a fiber optic cable to Sweden and a gas pipeline near Denmark suddenly drop offline. Signals intelligence suggests Russian military assets were near both sites minutes earlier. No one has yet been killed, no shot has been publicly acknowledged, but the escalation clock has just started ticking. Inside NATO command centers from Brussels to Norfolk, phones light up. Is this sabotage and electronic warfare of the kind Europe has seen since the Nord Stream explosions and cable cuts in the Baltic? Or is it the opening move in a campaign to blind the alliance before a conventional strike on its eastern flank? As staff sift through data on recent Russian hybrid attacks against undersea cables and infrastructure, intelligence officers urge caution. Politicians, under pressure from publics already jittery about war in Ukraine, demand a firm response that shows NATO territory is not a gray zone. On the other side, in Moscow and in joint command centers with Belarus, the mood is just as tense. Russian planners argue that NATO has been pushing its own red lines by supporting deep Ukrainian strikes and deploying more forces near the Suwalki Gap and the Finnish border. They remind the Kremlin that Russian tactical nuclear weapons have been moved into Belarus, and that new hypersonic systems like Oreshnik and Kinzhal are on alert, capable of hitting Allied command nodes in minutes. Others warn that a direct clash with NATO could trigger Article 5 and a multi-front war that Russia's exhausted army is poorly placed to fight. In this hypothetical night, nuclear forces rapidly move into the background of every decision, even if no one intends to use them. Both sides know Russia holds roughly 4,000 active nuclear warheads, with around 1,700 deployed strategic warheads, while the United States, United Kingdom, and France together field a comparable, though slightly smaller, deployed arsenal under the broader NATO umbrella. They also know New START's formal limits have expired, and while Moscow and Washington say they will informally stay near the old caps, the legal framework is gone. Limited escalate to de-escalate nuclear options sit in Russian contingency plans, while NATO's own nuclear sharing arrangement keeps B-61 bombs stationed in several European states and integrates nuclear planning into alliance strategy. Then we hit pause on the scenario. None of this exact chain of events has happened yet, but almost every ingredient already exists in reality. Hybrid attacks testing infrastructure resilience, Russian tactical nuclear deployments in Belarus, a rapidly militarizing eastern flank, shrinking warning times, and an arms race in artillery shells, missiles, and drones. So the real question becomes this: given current trajectories in NATO and Russia, are we on an automatic countdown to direct escalation, or is there still room to stabilize the confrontation? To answer that, we need to pull the camera back from the hypothetical crisis and dissect the context, the balance of forces, the key weapons, and the political logic that would drive decisions under pressure. After the Cold War, NATO and Russia briefly tried to build a cooperative security architecture. The 1990s saw arms control, deep nuclear reductions, and the NATO-Russia Council, which was supposed to provide a forum for transparency and crisis management. At the same time, NATO expanded eastward to include former Warsaw Pact states and later Baltic republics, while Russia's economy and military were weakened by internal turmoil. From Moscow's perspective, the combination of NATO enlargement and Western military interventions in places like Yugoslavia signaled that the alliance was no longer just defensive. From NATO's viewpoint, enlargement was about stabilizing fragile democracies and locking in a continent-wide peace. That uneasy compromise held for a time. Russia accepted NATO's role, but demanded political guarantees, culminating in the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act that talked about building a common space of security. In practice, though, Russian reforms stalled, and its security elites never stopped viewing NATO as the main external threat. NATO, for its part, prioritized crisis management operations outside its territory over heavy territorial defense. Armies shrank, stockpiles were cut, and substantial forces were withdrawn from Germany and the Baltic region. The first real fracture appeared in 2008 when Russia went to war with Georgia. Russian forces moved quickly, exposing weaknesses in NATO's ability to deter limited wars on the periphery. Allied reactions were rhetorically strong, but militarily cautious, and no major posture shift followed. For Russian planners, this confirmed that limited force could be used in the post-Soviet space with manageable Western responses. This lesson would matter enormously later in Ukraine. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and ignited a war in the Donbass using regular units, little green men, and information operations. NATO reacted with sanctions, increased air policing, and the decision to deploy multinational battalion-sized battle groups in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, under the Enhanced Forward Presence concept. These battle groups were not large enough to defeat an invasion, but were designed as a tripwire, forcing any attacker to confront multiple NATO flags on day one, and thereby making Article 5 activation politically unavoidable. Still, the scale of the response was limited compared to what came after 2022, and in Moscow the impression persisted that NATO would not fight directly over Ukraine or other neighbors. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 marked the decisive break. Deterrence failed on multiple levels. Russian elites convinced themselves that Western leaders were risk-averse, divided, and overly dependent on Russian energy. NATO, having drawn its own red line at direct intervention inside Ukraine, focused on arming Kyiv, but took months to build a truly credible reinforcement posture for the eastern flank. The war did, however, trigger a strategic shock in Europe. NATO's 2022 Madrid summit adopted a new strategic concept, labeling Russia as the most significant and direct threat, and set a new baseline for collective defense. Leaders approved plans to scale the alliance's high readiness forces from around 40,000 to roughly 300,000, and to move from tripwire battle groups toward brigade-level forces capable of real warfighting on the eastern flank. The message was clear. Territorial defense was back at the core of NATO's mission. Perhaps the most visible geopolitical shift came in the north. Finland formally joined NATO in April 2023, and Sweden followed in March 2024, ending decades of military non-alignment. With their accession, the alliance grew to 32 members, and effectively encircled the Baltic Sea with NATO territory, transforming the regional balance and exposing Russia's Kaliningrad enclave and its northwestern flank to a dense network of Allied bases and infrastructure. From Moscow's perspective, this was confirmation that the war in Ukraine had backfired strategically. Yet escalation is not driven by geography alone. It is shaped by the underlying balance of power. On paper, NATO and Russia look wildly asymmetric. In practice, geography, readiness, and political cohesion compress that advantage, especially in the first days of a crisis. In economic terms, NATO is a giant facing a medium-sized power. NATO members together account for well over half of global military spending, around $1.5 trillion in 2024, roughly 55% of the world total. Russia's own military expenditure, by contrast, was estimated at about $149 billion in 2024, approximately 7% of its GDP, and nearly a fifth of all Russian government spending. In pure resource terms, NATO can outspend Russia several times over. But in the short term, Moscow has advantages a global alliance struggles to match quickly. Russia has shifted decisively to a war economy. By 2025, it was dedicating around 7% of GDP to defense and related security spending, and intelligence assessments suggest actual military expenditures maybe even higher than official budgets show. Russian industry has ramped up ammunition production dramatically, producing more than 7 million artillery shells, rockets, and mortar rounds in 2025, up from 4.5 million in 2024, supplemented by large imports from North Korea. NATO's response has been to rearm and restructure. Allies have agreed not only to meet the old 2% of GDP defense guideline, but to move toward a new 5% security and defense target by the mid-2030s, with 3.5% devoted to core military capabilities and the remainder to related resilience and infrastructure. Between 2020 and 2024, NATO defense spending grew by almost $400 billion, with European allies and Canada together now investing above 2% of their combined GDP. On land, Russia entered the Ukraine war with one of the largest ground forces in Europe. But after years of attritional fighting, it has paid a staggering price. By early 2026, credible estimates put Russian casualties at close to 1.2 million killed and wounded, the heaviest losses suffered by a major power since the Second World War. Many pre-war elite units have been mauled and rebuilt with less experienced troops. Equipment losses in tanks and armored vehicles have forced Moscow to modernize old stocks and rely increasingly on infantry and artillery. NATO, conversely, has fewer forces actually fighting, but is relearning high-intensity warfare at scale. Eastern allies like Poland are buying hundreds of new tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany is scrambling to make itself war-ready again, while the Baltics and Nordics integrate their small but capable armies into a larger regional defense framework that assumes a possible conflict with Russia in the next few years. The alliance's new regional defense plans assign concrete divisions and brigades to specific sectors, with pre-positioned equipment and improved military mobility meant to allow rapid reinforcement. In the air and at sea, NATO's qualitative edge is sharper. The alliance fields far more modern combat aircraft, including large numbers of fourth- and fifth-generation fighters, advanced airborne early warning platforms, and a deep inventory of precision-guided munitions. Its navies dominate the North Atlantic and Mediterranean and are increasingly active in the Baltic and Arctic. Russia still retains a powerful missile and submarine force, but its conventional surface fleet is limited and has suffered losses in the Black Sea and elsewhere. However, Russia's ground-based air defenses remain formidable. Systems like S-300, S-400, and the newer S-350, integrated with early warning radars and airborne surveillance aircraft, have gained extensive combat experience in Ukraine and have adapted to Western-style standoff weaponry and drones. Any NATO air campaign against Russian forces near its borders would face a dense and well-practiced integrated air defense system that might blunt the alliance's traditional reliance on quick air supremacy. Behind this conventional balance looms the nuclear equation. Russia possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal when measured by total warheads, with roughly 5,460 warheads, including around 4,300 in its active military stockpile and about 1,700 deployed strategic warheads as of mid-decade estimates. The United States maintains roughly 3,700 active warheads, with about 1,770 deployed, while the United Kingdom and France together add around 515 more. NATO's nuclear posture rests on three pillars: United States strategic forces, French and British independent deterrence, and U.S. non-strategic B-61 bombs deployed in 5 European host countries under nuclear sharing arrangements. Russia, by contrast, has invested heavily in a large arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons and in new delivery systems such as Avangard, Kinzhal, Zircon, and now Oreshnik, many advertised as capable of penetrating missile defenses and striking time-sensitive targets deep in Europe. Both sides know that a full-scale nuclear exchange would be suicidal. The real escalation danger lies in limited nuclear options designed to de-escalate a conventional war by shocking the adversary into backing down. Analysts have long debated how far this concept shapes Russian planning, but the combination of doctrinal hints, exercises, and recent nuclear rhetoric suggests Moscow wants NATO to believe it might use nuclear weapons first if its conventional forces were losing. NATO in turn emphasizes that it has flexible nuclear response options, and that any nuclear use by Russia would fundamentally change the nature of a conflict. Beyond raw numbers and doctrine, escalation is shaped by the specific tools each side would use in a crisis. Russia's strongest cards at the conventional level are long-range fires, air defense, and now high-volume drone and missile production supported by a mobilized industry and partners such as North Korea and Iran. Its artillery and rocket forces have fired millions of rounds in Ukraine, perfecting techniques for massed fire and counter-battery operations. Russian air defenses, as noted, form thick belts around key regions like Kaliningrad, Crimea, and the area near the Baltic and Finnish borders. They are coupled with electronic warfare and camouflage that have challenged Ukrainian efforts to systematically destroy them, even with Western-supplied missiles. In a NATO conflict, these systems would seek to attrit Allied air power and cruise missiles, raising costs and slowing operations in the early days. At the strategic level, Russia's hypersonic systems are designed as a psychological and military tool. Avangard is a maneuvering boost glide vehicle mounted on an intercontinental ballistic missile, while Kinzhal is an air-launched ballistic missile and Zircon a hypersonic cruise missile that can be fired from ships and submarines. Orezhnik adds an intermediate-range ballistic system that Russia has started deploying to Belarus, bringing much of Europe within range and compressing warning times even further. NATO's strengths lie in precision, integration, and depth. The alliance dominates in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, using satellites, drones, and airborne platforms to build detailed pictures of the battlefield. Its air forces can deliver precise effects at long range against command posts, logistics hubs, and high-value assets. Western navies and air forces are also increasingly investing in missile defense and integrated air and missile defense networks to shield key nodes and cities. NATO enjoys a qualitative advantage in stealth aircraft, such as the F-35, which several European countries are acquiring for both conventional and potential nuclear roles. If war broke out, NATO would try to exploit this to punch corridors through Russian air defenses, blind sensors, and systematically degrade logistics. Yet doing so against a large, nuclear-armed state with massed SAM coverage is very different from past campaigns in Iraq or Serbia. Attrition could be severe, especially early on. A crucial and often underappreciated battleground is the gray zone. Since 2022, Russia has waged a persistent hybrid war against NATO and EU states, blending cyber attacks, disinformation, sabotage, arson, and drone incursions. Intelligence and open-source reporting link Russian state bodies and proxies like Wagner's remnants to attempted attacks on warehouses, logistics hubs, undersea cables, and energy infrastructure across Europe. These operations aim to destabilize societies and deter support for Ukraine while staying just below the threshold that would trigger Article 5. The Nord Stream pipeline sabotage in 2022 and subsequent damage to cables and pipelines in the Baltic Sea were turning points. They exposed how vulnerable Europe's critical maritime infrastructure is and forced NATO to boost naval and air patrols, deploy more maritime surveillance assets, and build new mechanisms to protect undersea cables and pipelines. Hybrid incidents have since multiplied around the Baltic and North Seas, and Allied officials now openly discuss being more proactive against Russian hybrid threats, including preemptive measures and stronger legal frameworks for response. All of this makes the potential escalation pathways more complex than simply Russia attacks, NATO responds. The Ukraine war has created a set of tacit red lines. Russia does not openly attack NATO territory, NATO does not deploy its own combat units in Ukraine or impose a no-fly zone, but it supplies Kyiv with weapons, intelligence, and training, and increasingly permits the use of Western long-range missiles against targets deep inside Russia. The most obvious flashpoint is Ukraine itself. Each time NATO steps up support, Moscow responds with nuclear rhetoric, large exercises, or limited attacks designed to remind Western capitals of escalation risks. When debates arise about giving Ukraine longer-range systems or enforcing air defense over Western Ukrainian airspace from NATO territory, Russian officials warn that such moves could be treated as direct participation and might justify strikes on NATO assets. What would it take for this proxy dynamic to tip into a direct NATO-Russia clash? One scenario is a major Russian strike that accidentally or deliberately hits NATO territory, killing large numbers of civilians or soldiers. Something like a missile strike that lands in Poland, Romania, or the Baltic states in the context of ongoing Russian operations against Ukraine. We have seen isolated cross-border incidents and airspace violations already, but so far they have been contained. The risk grows as both sides operate more aircraft, drones, and missiles near shared borders. If such an incident occurred and was judged intentional or extremely reckless, pressure to invoke Article 5 would be immense. Collective defense does not automatically mean immediate full-scale war, but it obliges allies to assist with actions they deem necessary, which could range from additional air defense and cyber measures to proportional strikes on Russian military assets. The danger is a spiral in which reciprocal, limited strikes and counterstrikes rapidly erode the remaining firebreak between proxy war and direct conflict. Another key escalation vector lies in the Baltic and Nordic region. The Suwalki Gap, a roughly 65-kilometer strip of Polish and Lithuanian territory between Kaliningrad and Belarus, remains one of NATO's most vulnerable stretches. Russian military thinkers have long seen this area as a potential corridor to cut off the Baltic states from the rest of the alliance in a crisis. Even small incursions, peacekeeping claims, or hybrid actions like blocking roads or rail lines here could force NATO into a rapid response under enormous time pressure. Since Finland and Sweden joined NATO, the map around the Baltic has become more favorable to the alliance, but also more crowded. NATO now has to protect a much longer border with Russia, stretching from the Arctic down through Finland to the Baltic states and Poland. Russia, in turn, has deployed additional forces and nuclear-capable systems in Kaliningrad and Belarus, conducted Zapad exercises with Belarusian troops, and signaled that Minsk is now fully under its nuclear umbrella with actual warheads deployed on Belarusian soil. A third escalation arena is the Black Sea and southeastern flank. Here, Russian and NATO ships and aircraft operate in proximity around the grain corridors, Romania's coast, and the approaches to the Bosphorus. Miscalculations, aggressive maneuvers, or accidents could spark incidents similar to Cold War confrontations at sea, but now in a context of hot war and heightened nuclear rhetoric. Turkey's role as both a NATO member and a regional power adds another layer of complexity that Moscow could seek to exploit or misjudge. Hybrid escalation may be the most likely way to test NATO's political nerve short of open war. A coordinated campaign of sabotage against energy infrastructure, telecoms, and transport hubs across several allies could cause significant economic damage and casualties without using overt military force. European and Allied intelligence services already report rising numbers of such plots, from arson attacks on warehouses to attempts against undersea cables. Each individual incident may fall below the Article 5 threshold, but a sustained pattern could prompt serious debate about collective retaliation. All of this raises a deeper question. Why did deterrence fail in 2014 and 2022, and what has changed since? From one perspective, NATO's problem was not capability, but signaling. After Georgia and Crimea, sanctions were significant but temporary. Military posture adjustments were modest, and red lines were never fully clarified. For Russian leadership, this looked like a pattern of Western reluctance to accept costs for defending the post-Cold War order. The war in Ukraine has corrected some of these perceptions. NATO has shown that it will sustain large-scale support for a partner over years, even at considerable economic cost, and that it is willing to rearm and reconfigure its own forces in response to Russian aggression. But the alliance still walks a tightrope. It must convince Moscow that any attack on NATO territory will trigger a powerful response, without convincing it that defeat in Ukraine automatically implies regime-threatening consequences that might justify nuclear escalation. Managing Russia's nuclear coercion is central to this balance. Since 2022, Moscow has repeatedly used nuclear threats and signals to try to deter Western support for Ukraine. From statements about defending new territories with all means, to exercises simulating nuclear strikes, to the highly publicized deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. NATO's response has evolved from initial caution to a more robust communications strategy that downplays rhetorical threats, emphasizes alliance resilience, and quietly adapts nuclear posture without mirroring every Russian move. At the same time, allies are updating their own nuclear arrangements. The modernization of B-61 gravity bombs into the more accurate B-61-12 and the integration of dual-capable aircraft like the F-35A into nuclear roles strengthen the credibility of NATO's theater deterrent. Separate but related initiatives, such as deeper nuclear cooperation between the UK and France, and discussions about broader European roles under the nuclear umbrella, signal that European allies are preparing for scenarios in which U.S. support might be less predictable, while still anchored in NATO structures. For NATO, another lesson is the centrality of resilience and mobilization. Deterrence today is not only about forward-deployed battle groups or air policing missions. It is about whether societies can absorb cyber shocks, disinformation campaigns, and energy disruptions without politically fragmenting. Hybrid attacks on undersea cables or logistics hubs matter not just for physical damage, but for testing public confidence in institutions and willingness to sustain long conflicts. Political cohesion is the alliance's biggest strength and its greatest vulnerability. Russia's strategy explicitly aims to exploit differences between allies, encourage domestic political movements skeptical of NATO, and use tools from energy leverage to covert funding and information operations to weaken support for Ukraine. If Moscow believes that time and pressure will split the alliance, it may be more willing to take risks at the gray zone or even kinetic level, expecting that NATO will hesitate in its response. For Russia itself, the lesson of Ukraine is brutal. Short wars with quick political payoffs are unlikely against determined, well-armed opponents supported by powerful coalitions. Russia's conventional forces have been severely attrited. Its economy is under long-term strain as military spending crowds out other priorities and sanctions restrict technology and capital. Relying on nuclear weapons as a substitute for conventional strength may seem attractive in the short term, but it carries enormous strategic risk. Any limited nuclear use would fundamentally reshape Russia's relationship with the world, likely locking in economic isolation and prompting unprecedented NATO responses. So where does this leave the countdown to escalation between NATO and Russia? Structurally, the picture is worrying. Military forces on both sides of the contact line in Europe are larger, more ready, and more integrated into war plans than at any time since the 1980s. Warning times are shrinking as high-precision weapons and hypersonic systems reduce decision windows from hours to minutes. Hybrid operations blur the boundary between peace and war and make it harder to decide when an attack has actually occurred. Yet escalation is not automatic. There remain several stabilizing factors. First, both sides have strong incentives to avoid direct war because of the catastrophic costs, especially under the nuclear shadow. Second, even at the height of current tensions, limited channels of communication persist, including military-to-military contacts and emerging discussions about some form of post-New START arms control understanding. Third, there is growing recognition in both NATO and the EU that resilience against hybrid threats must be treated as core security policy, not a secondary issue. Efforts to harden undersea infrastructure, share intelligence on sabotage networks, and coordinate responses to cyber incidents make it harder for Russia to exploit gray zones without consequences. These measures do not eliminate risk, but they reduce Moscow's ability to calibrate pressure precisely at the threshold of Allied unity. More broadly, the future trajectory of escalation will depend heavily on three political variables: the outcome and shape of the war in Ukraine, the evolution of U.S. and European domestic politics, and their willingness to sustain defense spending and support for allies, and the degree to which Russia's leadership believes its long-term security is better served by confrontation or some form of accommodation. If Ukraine stabilizes on terms that Moscow sees as acceptable, with no imminent NATO accession and some face-saving narrative of having secured security guarantees, the Kremlin might see less need to test NATO militarily and instead focus on economic and political influence. If, however, Russia perceives itself as losing decisively or facing a NATO that is moving toward deployments and missile place systems it considers intolerable, the temptation to use risk-taking behavior to change the strategic equation could grow. In a best-case scenario, current rearmament leads not to war, but to a new, more sober equilibrium. NATO completes its shift to credible territorial defense. Russia recognizes that further conventional adventurism against alliance members would be self-destructive. Both sides accept that some form of arms control, crisis communication, and mutual restraint on cyber and space operations is necessary to avoid accidents spiraling out of control. In a worst-case scenario, a combination of miscalculation in Ukraine, hybrid attacks against critical infrastructure, and aggressive moves in places like the Suwalki Gap or the Baltic Sea trigger a chain of actions and reactions that political leaders struggle to stop. NATO would likely win any prolonged conventional conflict, given its superior industrial base and access to resources. But the cost could be immense, and the nuclear threshold might be tested in ways not seen since the Cold War. Ultimately, the countdown to escalation is not a fixed clock, but a dynamic process shaped by decisions taken every month and every year. Each new deployment, each hybrid attack, each decision about arms deliveries or defense spending either adds friction to escalation or lubricates the path to it. The hard truth is that both NATO and Russia are now locked into a long period of confrontation, with direct war neither inevitable nor impossible. Managing that reality requires not only tanks, missiles, and shells, but also strategy, discipline, and a willingness to think several steps ahead rather than react in anger in the middle of the night.